right, let's dive into the world of European craft. We're talking about a space that's just brimming with tradition and beauty, but it's also facing a whole lot of modern pressure. We're going to unpack a really fascinating paradox today. How can something so seemingly delicate also be so unbelievably tough?
Just look at this. This is exactly what's at stake. You're seeing centuries of skill, of knowledge, of cultural identity, all wrapped up in one beautiful object. But for the artisans, the people whose hands create these things, the last 5 years have been a non-stop battle for survival.
You know, this quote just hits the nail on the head. It splits the maker from the market. It tells us that while the spirit of the artisan is tough as nails, the actual business of craft, well, that's incredibly fragile. And that's the real tension we're digging into.
So yeah, this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? You throw a global pandemic, a war that messes up all the supply chains, and a massive cost of living crisis into the mix. I mean, how are Europe's craft makers really doing? The answer, as you're about to see, is probably not what you're thinking.
Okay, so let's get to our first key finding. And this is the one that really made researchers sit up and take notice. Because in an environment that should have just flattened the whole sector, something else happened. Something totally unexpected.
32%. Let that sink in for a second. After a period of just unbelievable crisis, a major European study found that nearly a third of craft makers felt much more resilient. They weren't just surviving, they felt stronger. I mean, how was that even possible?
Well, it turns out this isn't really a story you can find on a balance sheet. What the researchers were blown away by was the sheer positivity. This hardy, strong-willed drive these makers had. This resilience seems to be something deeply personal, like it's woven into the very fabric of being an artisan.
But look, to really get why that resilience is so incredible, we have to understand the massive pressures they are up against. This wasn't just a bit of bad weather. It was a perfect storm hitting them from every possible direction.
For the last 5 years, it's felt like they've been under constant siege. The challenges have been relentless, affecting everything from the price of wood or clay to whether they could even open their workshop doors.
Let's kind of break these threats down. So on one side, you have the huge external shocks. Over 60% of makers were hit hard by COVID-19. Then, the war in Ukraine made supply chains even worse, and the energy crisis sent the cost of materials and shipping through the roof. But honestly, those big headline-grabbing crises, they're only half the story. There's another threat, one that's a lot quieter.
And this right here, this is what the makers themselves are most afraid of in the long run. More than any single crisis, they said, the most urgent threat is the slow, steady erosion of craft education. The very pathways designed to pass their skills down to the next generation are disappearing.
So, if the business model is so fragile and the educational pipeline is cracking, how on earth are these makers pulling through? Well, the answer seems to be in a unique toolkit of skills that they've honed over time. When they were asked what skills are key to being resilient, the number one answer, and we're talking a massive 72%, was problem solving. It's just the essence of being a maker, right? That ability to adapt, to improvise, to just figure it out. Of course, that was followed by the practical stuff, like knowing how to sell, how to market, and how to network.
And you can see that blend perfectly right here. Today's successful craftsperson is a bit of a hybrid. They're pairing these timeless, hands-on techniques with some really modern business savvy, using online shops and social media to connect with customers all over the world.
And what's amazing is that this approach is working because craft just happens to be perfectly in tune with some of the biggest shifts in how we think as consumers. People want sustainability. They want to know the story behind a product. They want authenticity. And they want to support individual creators. Craft, well, it delivers on all of it. But this all brings us back to that really critical long-term threat. Okay, so individual makers are resilient. We've established that. But what about the craft itself? The survival of these incredible skills depends completely on our ability to pass them on. This is the question that's just hanging over the entire sector. You know, a resilient maker is one thing, but a resilient tradition? That needs a healthy system for knowledge to get from one generation to the next. And right now, that system is in real trouble.
The good news, though, is that we have models for how to do this right. If you look at countries like Austria, Germany, and Slovenia, they have these amazing, highly structured master craftsman qualifications. In Germany, getting that certification is considered on par with a bachelor's degree. In Austria, it gives you the right to run your own business and, this is the crucial part, to train the next generation of apprentices.
But in places where those structures are weak or don't exist, well, the consequences are pretty stark. In the UK, for instance, the number of skilled bobbin lace makers has dropped by 30%. Unlike knitting or crochet, it just hasn't had that modern revival, and the skills are just fading away. This is what happens when you break the chain of learning.
And what's so critical to understand is that the problem isn't a lack of interest. As one UK training provider put it so clearly, there are plenty of young people who want to learn this stuff. The desire is there. The pathway for them to learn, that's what's broken.
So what's the solution? Individual resilience, as amazing as it is not enough. To really secure the future of craft, we have to move beyond just supporting the individual maker and start building a resilient ecosystem for the entire sector.
The very first step is a change in how we think. We need to start seeing craft as living heritage. What that means is we stop treating it like a historical relic you'd see in a museum and start valuing it as a dynamic, evolving body of knowledge, as real intellectual and cultural capital.
So, building this ecosystem requires a real strategy. The research points to a few key things. We need coordinated EU policy and financial support. We need to do more research into what education is needed, and we need better data to actually prove the sector's value. And of course, we need to raise public awareness about why craft is so important, both culturally and economically.
And this really brings us to the final takeaway. The future of craft isn't about being nostalgic. It's about seeing it for what it truly is, a progressive, powerful response to some of our biggest modern challenges. It's a model for sustainability, for local production, and for meaningful work.
Which really leaves us with this final thought. The evidence is clear. The craftsperson is resilient. They have the passion, the skill, and the grit to get through anything. The real question is our support, is our system of support resilient enough to make sure that they and their invaluable skills actually have a future?